Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. We are in different time zones, so my greetings for all time zones go out to you. My name is Gudrun Wacker. I'm working in the Asia division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and I have been asked to chair this session. And this session will address the question of the European Union or Europe's role on the Korean Peninsula. So we will ask whether there is a new role for Europe in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. We have 4 speakers and 1 commentator for this session, and I'm very happy to introduce my European colleagues very briefly. And we start with Antoine Bondas. He is a research fellow and the director of both the Korea program and the Taiwan program at Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. Second, we have my colleague Erik Heilbach from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, where he is the Korea Foundation Fellow. Third, we have Teresa Nowotna, who is a Senior Associate Research Fellow at Europeum, and Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Center for European Integration at the Free University in Berlin. And then we have the final panelist, who is Ramon Pacheco Pardo. Ramon is Professor of International Relations at King's College in London and the Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance at Vrije Universiteit in Brussels. And then we are very happy that the EU ambassador to South Korea, Maria Castillo Fernandez, has agreed to comment briefly on the session. She has a very long experience. I looked up your CV, and you have been on many postings in Asia, so you're an old Asia hand. You posted in Korea now, so we're very happy that you can join the panel. And without further ado, let me just say we have basically the panelists will address 2 dimensions. First of all, there is the dimension of the growing US-China rivalry, which sort of sets the strategic global context for everything we speak about. So I would ask Teresa to go first and talk about this topic. And then we have 3 inputs that will more specifically talk about the Korean Peninsula and the possible role of the European Union or Europe more generally. And here I would ask my colleague Erik Balbach to go first, because he will introduce the new Indo-Pacific approach to the region that the EU is in the making within the European Union. And then we proceed from there with Antoine and Ramon, if that's okay with you. And in the end, I will ask the ambassador to give her comment. You each have 10 minutes. I hope you will be disciplined. And I'm also have been asked to introduce for the people who participate in this meeting, either in the room or via YouTube, that you can ask questions. There is a QR code which you can scan if you are in the room and ask your questions there. When you follow the link, the people who follow on YouTube have a link at the bottom of the site, and they can click that link, and then they will be led to a place where they can ask their questions. So please make use of that, and I hope that we will be able to have some questions and answers. Answers would be even better in the end of this session. So without further ado, I ask Teresa to go first. The floor is yours, Teresa.
Yes, hello everyone. 안녕하세요. Thank you very much to Korea Global Forum for Peace for setting this panel up. As a European, I'm especially happy that we've been invited, because I think it's a good sign that Europe is no longer considered just a bystander on the Korean Peninsula, but that it's seen more and more as an actor on its own. And it's, of course, very good also from the European perspective that its ambition to play a global role is actually making, headways. And, as people in Brussels like to say, that we are actually advancing our strategic autonomy. I would also like to say that I'm very happy to be on this panel as a woman, because we have, I think, perfect gender parity, gender balance, and that's not always the case. So I'm very happy that I think Eric basically set this up this way. I will be talking about US-China relations, but obviously the panel is about new role for Europe in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, so I will definitely say a few words about Korean Peninsula as well. But before I do that, I would like to set this broader context and look what has changed in the last several years. Well, first of all, of course, we have a new US administration in place, and I've been following some of the panels online, and quite a few people were commenting on the fact that Joe Biden is taking a more measured approach, sort of step-by-step commitment approach to the DPRK. And that this is a good thing, because one thing we've learned from the previous administration is with regard to North Korea, that the big summits or the sort of all or nothing approach doesn't work unless it's accompanied by sort of more lower level security negotiations. I would definitely agree to that, but I would say there is a big but or big however. And that I would argue is that perhaps Donald Trump's gut feeling to think about the situation on the Korean Peninsula a bit outside of the box and try out new things, try out the new approaches was actually the right one. Of course, then the implementation went sort of belly up for various reasons, lack of knowledge, preparedness, and so on. But sort of the big point to try something new was a good one, and I'm slightly a bit worried that the current Democratic administration may just be doing all the traditional things, and so neither the Democrats nor the Europeans should sort of discard the previous approach of trying to come up with new ideas just because Donald Trump has done it in the past. Obviously, on the other hand, I don't want to argue that whatever Joe Biden has been doing is wrong, but maybe at some point, we may need a sort of a review of the North Korea review in the US. And by the way, I think the Europeans also need a review of their own North Korea policy, but I'll come back to that. So the big change which I'm supposed to talk about is the US-China competition. Well, when Donald Trump took over, Obama apparently told him that North Korea would be the biggest challenge he would be dealing with during his tenure. Had there been such a meeting between Trump and Biden, I'm pretty sure that China would be the one message Donald Trump would have sent to Joe Biden. Yesterday, we could have listened to Joe Biden's speech about, reasoning behind his withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Afghanistan. But I think clearly one of the reasons is also to sort of refocus the U.S. attention and U.S. assets to the US-China competition and various theaters around the globe where this competition can manifest itself. And sort of moving to the Korean Peninsula, in a way, Korean Peninsula might become one of those theaters. On one hand, the EU and South Korea are at the moment in quite similar position, being sort of squeezed between the US and Chinese pressures to sort of, I don't want to say it's two sides, but to kind of behave along the wishes of one or the two. I have already suggestions how the EU and South Korea could deal with this situation. Surely one would be to actually strengthen its strategic partnerships, so the strategic partnership with the EU and the ROK, to expand it in possibly further fields. But currently, basically the health area would be one, climate change would be another one. But there are many others, like say, including me speaking as an academic, so academic and people-to-people exchanges. So that would be one way. The other way would be to perhaps look at other like-minded partners which might be in a similar position as the EU and South Korea. Perhaps one region which comes to my mind is the countries of the ASEAN, where President Moon's southern policy, as well as the EU's new emphasis on ASEAN, sort of complement each other. But because we are talking about the Korean Peninsula, I would like to talk more about what to do with the peace process, or rather, what to do about North Korea. And to some extent, at the moment, we are still not sure, or it is still not clear whether the PRK may become one of those very rare areas where the United States and China are still able to cooperate on, or whether it may become one of those areas where the competition will just escalate further. And obviously, it is in the interest of both the EU and South Korea to prevent North Korea from becoming one of those areas of possible escalation. Clearly, the disagreements are already there between the US and China. We can just have a look at the approach to sanctions on both sides. Since I was talking about comparing sort of the beginnings of the administration of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it's quite clear that even if Joe Biden wanted to sort of have a maximum pressure 2.0, he can't. He won't have the same commitment by the Chinese side, even though at that time the Chinese commitment was a bit questioned. Nevertheless, China is not going to jump on the bandwagon to sort of put even more pressure on North Korea. So the last few points, I would like to raise some issues or some suggestions what Europe can do. I'm pretty sure my colleagues will be talking more about sort of the EU policy towards North Korea, which is called critical engagement. So I will skip it and I'll leave it up to them. But I still think it's important to think about certain steps that the European Union could do. And so I would sort of summarize them into 3 points. The one would be to plan, the second one would be to set the agenda, and the third one would be to multilateralize. So I'll start with the first one, and that's the planning part. I think my colleague Eric will be talking about the EU's new Indo-Pacific strategy. So I don't want to talk too much about that, but what I found quite interesting is if you compare the EU one with the German one, is that basically the EU one is quite different. North Korea doesn't appear at all, and even South Korea appears there once, and China appears there once in terms of trade relations. While in the German one, you have North Korea mentioned as sort of a successful example of how Germany has been upholding international law, meaning upholding the sanctions against the DPRK. I have my personal doubts about the effectiveness of these sanctions, but nevertheless, the point is that DPRK is there in the strategy. So what I would like to say is that since the EU does not talk about the DPRK in the broader context, the broader strategy, perhaps there would be a good time to have a specific strategy for the Korean Peninsula. It doesn't need to be called strategy on North Korea, but say a strategy for peace process or peace area for engagement member states. So maybe the strategy would actually come up with some kind of middle ground. The EU also could offer various services and its presence. EU has always been very proud of the fact that it has 6 embassies on the ground in Pyongyang. Well, because of the COVID situation, there are only Bulgarian and Romanian diplomats left at the moment. So first of all, one could make more use of those who are still on the ground. But perhaps once the EU or other member states go back to Pyongyang, instead of sort of competing who will come first and at what time, the good idea would be to come back as an EU and have sort of an EU presence, EU delegation, EU liaison officer, and so on to go back. I can see that I have almost run out of time. So maybe just 2 last points. Apart from sort of all different confidence-building measures that could EU offer, it could also offer to draft what I call a Borel peace plan. So sort of to draft what the EU would actually want that happens on the Korean Peninsula. And the EU has had obviously quite a good experience with having experience with different peace processes. It has been founded on a peace process itself, but also has been helping in this respect to other countries in Colombia, in the Balkans, and so on. And the last point: why would North Korea and others should agree to it, but especially why North Korea? Well, because multilateralization is the only way how North Korea can feel that any agreement can actually survive. That it can survive change of the US administration, but that it can also survive changes at the international level. And I think this is where the EU can play the most substantive role. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. That was almost perfect in terms of time discipline. And I think you already raised a lot of issues that will be addressed in more detail in the following input. So, Eric, you will address the Indo-Pacific, strategy. We haven't seen it yet. We just have seen the Council conclusions, but the floor is yours, Eric.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good for the introduction. I think I will pick up right where Teresa left off, basically with one of the points she made. And I think we are currently witnessing what is arguably one of the most far-reaching shifts in priorities in the EU's foreign and security policy we have seen in quite a while, meaning we could talk about the EU's pivot to the Indo-Pacific. Within the EU, national policy guidelines and strategy papers on the Indo-Pacific were first published by France in 2018 and 2019, as well as Germany and the Netherlands both in 2020. These 3 countries have been working together to promote an Indo-Pacific concept or vision to be adopted by the EU, and the national strategy papers are to be understood, to quote my colleague Gudrun Wacker here, who has published extensively on those matters, as contributions and building blocks to lead to an EU position on the Indo-Pacific. So France, Germany, and the Netherlands, basically a joint non-paper in autumn 2020, which emphasizes 4 areas for the EU to focus on, meaning trade, connectivity, maritime security, and global issues such as climate change and biodiversity, among others. In April 2021, the EU then adopted the first 9-page Council conclusion on the EU's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which kind of gave a first hint emphasis in Brussels' own Indo-Pacific strategy basically lies. The conclusion, which is said to reflect Brussels' renewed commitment to and the long-term focus on the Indo-Pacific, sets out the EU's intention to reinforce its strategic focus, presence, and actions in what is termed a region of prime strategic importance for EU interests. According to the document, the primary objective of the new strategy are to contribute to regional stability, security, prosperity, and sustainable development, and will be based upon upholding democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and the respect for national law. So basically, if we talk about the Korean Peninsula here, and what does a new Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU mean for the EU's own Korea policy in the mid and longer term, I think the main question will be if an eventual EU strategy, which we expect in about 3 weeks, how an eventual EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific will deal with the manifold hard security issues in the region. Thus far, we see, of course, a clear focus on more non-traditional security threats, on more non-traditional security issue, apart from maritime security. But overall, with the stated objectives, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy will also be, of course, to strengthen peace, security, and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. It will aim at increasing engagement in regional security issues. At the same time, however, the resulting initiatives, and this is what we, of course, expect, will mainly focus, like I said, on maritime security as well as non-traditional security challenges. And the reason or main explanation to this, of course, is that we have to acknowledge here an immediate nexus between prosperity in Europe and security in Asia, which will most likely be established in Europe's own Indo-Pacific strategy. And it is mainly in the context of this security nexus that regional policy-related risk and challenges, such as the peace issue on the Korean Peninsula, will be interpreted. Yet, at the same time, an EU-wide strategy on the region simply cannot afford to avoid these traditional security, hard security issues if it wants to be taken seriously as a trustable security actor in the region. So the formulation of an EU Indo-Pacific strategy therefore provides an opportunity for Brussels to position itself in and more actively to the diffusion of the major conflicts in the region. In the case of Korea, of course, this would require a more constructive role to ensure stability. So we have to see this against the background that, of course, when it comes to North Korea, the EU's policies have been rather, let's say, focused on implementing sanctions. But when it comes to South Korea, security cooperation between the EU and South Korea have dramatically increased during the last year, as my colleague Ramon also has published extensively on. Heiko Maas, the still German foreign minister, said in the preface of the German policy guidelines on the Indo-Pacific that Germany must address even more strongly the existential security concerns of its long-standing partners, be involved in coming up with responses and make a tangible contribution in this regard. So if we consider South Korea as one of those core partners in the region, this, of course, also means that we simply cannot ignore the security issue on the Korean Peninsula in the mid and longer term. Of course, becoming more engaged in the Korean Peninsula security affairs certainly no easy task for Europe. But if Brussels adopts a realistic approach based on European interest, there is certainly room for Europe to cooperate, not only with a new Southern policy being pursued by the current Moon Jae-in administration in South Korea, but also in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. And in fact, if we take a closer look at German policy guidelines, we see that they already contain some of the major tools for a sensible involvement of Berlin, but also of Brussels in Korean Peninsula security affairs. The stated objective, strengthen peace, security, and stability in the Indo-Pacific regions, I think Brussels should aim at an increasing engagement in regional security issues in three specific issue areas. First, increasing its security policy engagement. Second, continuing to implement measures for civil crisis prevention, conflict management, peace building. And third, increasing its arms control and export control policy engagement in and with the Indo-Pacific. All of those areas, all of those issue areas will be inherent elements of any lasting peace process on the Korean Peninsula as well. So we see that a sensible approach is, of course, possible here. And in fact, the EU and its member states already significantly increased its resources and engagement in the field of stabilization and mediation in the past years, including in the Indo-Pacific. So as such, there is both room and potential for transferring these experiences to the case of Korea. And a number of EU member states already have signaled their willingness to share their experiences and provide expertise to the region, strengthening both arms export control and arms control, participate in collective security measures, and of course also help implement UN resolutions, what we are already seeing at the moment. So EU member states in this regard and the EU itself is already working to strengthen and expand security policy engagement with and within the region, for example, through the project Enhancing Security Cooperation in and with Asia, which was commissioned by the EU and the German Federal Foreign Office, and which is jointly implemented by France and Germany. So to this end, we are already undertaking, in a way, specific measures to aid the EU in raising its profile as a regional security actor and extending its field of action on the basis of the global strategy for the European Union's foreign and security policy. In this regard, I would double down on what Teresa has said as well. I think in some ways we are already making headways. In other ways, of course, in other areas, of course, these are still very difficult issues to deal with. So I would double down on what Teresa said and what Antoine already proposed in earlier publications as well, to basically have a critical review of current EU policy, not only with regard to North Korea, but how to sync it with a larger Korea policy of the EU, both North and South. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for introducing the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm always careful to use the word strategy when it comes to the European Union. We don't know yet what will be in the longer paper that we expect for actually this month. It should come out mid of this month. We will see what will be in it. I think in the German paper, indeed, there is a focus on non-proliferation, arms trade, disarmament, which I haven't seen in the Council conclusions so much. So we will see how it pans out in the end. And how the strategy will look. So, Antoine, you're next up, and maybe you have already done this critical review of the European North Korea policy. So let's hear from you what your suggestions are.
Thank you very much, Gudrun, and it's always a pleasure to be with friends, especially with Teresa, Eric, Ramon, and Ambassador Fernandez. So for once, actually, I will talk a little bit less about the proliferation crisis in North Korea, and maybe a little bit more about the North Korea's development and what we can do actually for it. Of course, it doesn't change anything about what Teresa and Eric mentioned before in my previous publication on the need actually for the EU and the member states to move from the current critical engagement strategy to implemented what I call a more proactive strategy of credible commitments in 4 areas that are political engagement, non-proliferation, the implementation of restrictive measures, and the engagements with the North Korean people. And as I repeatedly stressed it over the last 2 and 3 years, such a renewed strategy should be highly coordinated, build on the many initiatives that already exist, and be facilitated by the appointment of an EU special representative on Korean Peninsula or on North Korea. But today I will address actually the North Korean insecurity complex, because this is fundamental not only to find, of course, a solution to the proliferation crisis, but above all to reduce tensions and the risk of escalation in the event of an incident. And we must learn to live with a North Korea that is not only nuclear, but also has significant and increased asymmetric capabilities, as evidenced actually by the recent development of short-range ballistic capabilities that will soon allow North Korea to conduct, for the very first time actually, precision strikes on South Korea. An increase in inter-Korean tension, as in 2010 or 2016, 2017, is a threat to regional peace and stability, and thus, of course, to European interest. And addressing the North Korean insecurity complex is fundamental. And in this context, the issue of developing the country and improving the lives of North Koreans is also essential. And we can get into eternal debates about lifting sanctions, even though we unfortunately know the answer. As long as there is no concrete progress in the negotiation between the US and North Korea, it is very unrealistic to hope for a partial lifting of these sanctions. And as Europeans, our leverage in these negotiations is limited. As I often say, we cannot choose the course of the river or even make it flow if it is dry, but we can amplify its flow if it starts flowing again. Today, therefore, I would like to address the issue of North Korea's development, especially on economic and developmental terms, taking into account, of course, the current political and legal context, which is that of a country subject to international sanctions. And above all, I will insist on what Europeans can do on their own without depending on others, because this is actually what practical realization of strategic autonomy is, and what Teresa mentioned before. So my presentation today, I will try to be as brief as possible, could be entitled basically Contributing Without Trading Anymore, and the evolving role of Europeans in contributing to North Korea's developments and reducing its insecurity complex. I know that talking about the Europeans' role in North Korea's development might sound a little bit weird, when in 2019, the European Union member states accounted for less than 0.25% of North Korea's foreign trade. Yet, Europe historically played a very important role in the reconstruction and in the economic development of North Korea. And even today, the Europeans keep actually a very important role in terms of humanitarian assistance. And indeed, all too often, analysis of relation between Europe and North Korea began actually in the 1990s. Of course, that's not the case. And Eastern European countries provided direct support for the reconstruction of North Korea, including East Germany, etc. As early as the 1960s, North Korea opened trade offices in West Germany, then in France, etc. And these countries played a role in the development. In the end of the 1990s, of course, this is what is mostly studied, especially in December 1998, the European Commission, of course, called for a more active engagement with North Korea. And following the establishment of diplomatic relations and the publication of a country strategy paper, the EU strategy, let's call it this way, on North Korea in 2001, the economic developments and economic exchanges was one of the key aspects of EU-DPRK relation. And at the end of the 1990s, the EU countries, back then the EU 15, accounted for almost 15% of North Korea's trade. But especially beyond trade, what was very important was capacity building. And several European countries played a key role in multiplying capacity building program with the DPRK. That's the case of Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Sweden, and even Switzerland, if we extend, of course, to non-EU countries. Even the European Union actually directly financed some events, including the DPRK EU Economic Modernization Workshop in 2004, 2005, and 2007. In parallel, of course, the Europeans played a crucial and key role in providing significant humanitarian aid at a time when the North Korean people, of course, needed it most at the end of the 1990s. At that time, North Korea accounted for more than 5% of the total humanitarian aid provided by the Europeans to the other countries. And between 1997 and 2000, the EU Commission alone, even without the member states, provided more than 150 million US dollars in aid to the DPRK through actually three channels: bilateral aid through the European Community Humanitarian Aid Office, what we call ECHO, what we used to call ECHO, the funding of international organizations, and aid provided to European NGOs operating in North Korea. What is also very important is to say that that policy of active engagement, let's call it this way, started to change after the second nuclear crisis in the early 2000s. And the development of economic relations back then was, of course, no longer the priority. But contrary to what is too often written, it is very important to insist on the fact that trade between Europe and North Korea collapsed before the international sanctions, and especially the resolution 2070, 2321 in 2016, 2371, 2375, 2397 in 2017, etc. So the collapse of the trade arrived and happened before these international sanctions. So these international sanctions per se are not actually the cause of that collapse of the trade, because between 2002 and 2015, the share of the EU countries as part of the North Korean foreign trade collapsed actually from 13% to less than 0.5%. And it was once again before the European Union adopted autonomous sanctions, also called restrictive measures, in 2016 and 2017. In parallel, except trade, humanitarian assistance kept on flowing to North Korea, and this is very, very important. According to data that are not often used, because most of the time, we focus on EU data, but we should focus on EU plus EU member states data. But if we collect all of this data, between 2007 and 2019, the European Union and the member states contributed to around 250 million in humanitarian aid, with a peak in 2011. And some member states were very active, such as Sweden, Germany, but also France. What is very, very important now is also to recall that the EU NGOs, or the European NGOs, 4 of them are actually residents before COVID, of course, resident NGOs in the country. So Première Urgence Internationale, Triangle Génération Humanitaire, Concern Worldwide, and the Weltunger Life, but I don't speak, my German is a bit bad. But among all of the NGOs that are resident NGOs in North Korea, the 4 of them, all of them, are from Europe. If you take the example of Triangle Génération Humanitaire, a French NGO that has been operating since 2002, they are financed actually by the French government, EU institutions, EU member states, and they are conducting projects in agricultural development, rehabilitation of drinking water system, improvement of sanitary infrastructures, distribution of aid to children, etc. So why am I saying all that? I'm saying all that because even with the current international sanction, and despite these constraints, we can actually be much more active in what we do with and in North Korea, of course, when the situation will allow it, when the pandemic will be under control. What is very important is not only to recall that the EU has played a role, but that the EU can keep playing, and the Europeans in general can keep playing a role. Before the pandemic, I was advocating actually for the Europeans to be much more involved using the global fund. So the global funds working mostly on tuberculosis. This is an international disease system initiative, of course, that the Europeans have been funding and supporting heavily, including in October 2019, when some EU member states, including France, Germany, increase considerably their funding for the initiative. But there is another issue that I'm really interested in, and and it would be my conclusion, would fit specifically the objective and the priorities of the Europeans. That lever, if you can call it this way, is of course the continuous increasement of capacity building in North Korea. In January 2020, Chairman Kim Jong-un underlined, actually in the country, the need to, I quote, take decisive measures for protecting the ecological environment and establish a nationwide crisis management system to cope with natural disaster. Natural disaster and the uneasiness for the North Korean government to deal with it has a huge impact, not only to the North Korean people, but also to put potential instability in the Korean Peninsula, and building efficient and responsive disaster relief mechanism in order to limit the effect of natural disasters, especially floods in North Korea, and some happened actually a few weeks ago, should be a priority. We have the experience actually in doing so. Some European NGOs, including a German foundation like the Hans Seidel Foundation, from 2014 to 2017, worked basically on a project to basically reforest, so improve sustainable forestry in the DPRK. And we could go actually much further than that. So one initiative would be, of course, to advise the North Korean experts on our own crisis disaster relief mechanism, be it at the EU member state level, including facing floods, but also at the EU level. This is something that is being discussed, of course, more and more within the European Union because of climate change, because of natural disaster, because of what happened all around the Mediterranean over the last few weeks in terms of forest fire, etc. So we do have an expertise. We have a key expertise. We have experience. We have, of course, kind of an experience in dealing with a North Korean expert on that. And I really believe that by focusing on humanitarian aid, climate change, natural disaster, etc., that's something that would fit perfectly into our own Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is something I would conclude on. The Indo-Pacific, of course, might sound being mostly on security. I know that the French have been sometimes criticized within Europe for being too security focused. I think it's changing very fast. We've been working actually a lot with the administration, the French government, to make sure that it was not only on security. The new French strategy was published in July, just before the French president visit to Japan and to French Polynesia. And there is a huge actually focus on climate change through many initiatives, especially in the South Pacific, especially in the Indian Ocean. But we could do and we should do more, including in the Korean Peninsula. And what the South Korean authority, the Ministry of Unification and Health, cannot do directly in terms of bilateral discussion or bilateral capacity building with North Korea, some European NGOs, some European experts could do so. So once again, just to conclude, that would be one of my key points for today. Not on non-proliferation for once, etc., but in terms of North Korea developments, the role that the European can play in capacity building, especially in the building of a mechanism to face and better prepare to natural disaster, because we are all, of course, victims of these natural disasters, some of them being more man-made than others.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoine, for reminding us of the role that the EU and EU member states have played in the past, especially in the 1990s, when the EU was also a member of KEDO. And, you know, we seem to have forgotten these activities, so it's good to be reminded and to make some fresh provide some fresh ideas where we could have a focus without violating the sanctions and where there is wiggle room for the European Union. So the final input comes from Ramon. I don't see him, but I'm sure he is there somewhere. And I believe he will speak about whether there is anything in the European experience that the Korean Peninsula could make use of. Ramon, are you somewhere?
Yes, can you hear me? Perfect.
Yes, and we can see you now.
Perfect, thank you very much. And thanks, as my colleagues were saying, thanks for the invitation to the ministry, but also Eric for putting this panel together. It's great to be together with friends, as Antoine just said. Indeed, I was asked to focus on how can the European experience potentially inform the relationship between the two Koreas, especially. I should say that I have just come back from 6 weeks in Korea and in South Korea, and interestingly, this has been a topic of discussion in many meetings, not only with the Ministry of Unification, but also with MOFA, for example, and including with some people in the Blue House as well. I think it's quite clear, we can all acknowledge this, that the current administration is going to continue to press for inter-Korean links as much as possible, even if it seems unlikely that there's going to be a breakthrough like the one that could have happened in 2018, 2019, but it is going to press ahead with inter-Korean reconciliation, inter-Korean links, economic links, and other types of links. Interestingly, we have seen how some of the liberal candidates for the election next year, they have already released the North Korea strategy, and it looks very similar to the strategy of the current administration. So we'll assume that the liberal president would continue along the same lines of the current one. But even talking to advisors, to conservative candidates, they do acknowledge that they don't want to go back to 2017 when we had Fire and Fury, or 2010 when we have the Yongbyon selling and the Cheonan sinking. So there would be some sort of push for engagement even under a conservative administration, even if it would be less pronounced than under a liberal administration. So this takes us to the role that the European experience can actually play in supporting inter-Korean links. And I think there has been a change in thinking in Korea in recent years as to what European experiences, so experiences with an S at the end, can actually help to inform the approach that South Korea might take towards North Korea. In the past, of course, it was very much focused on the German experiences, the other country divided between a capitalist, democratic side and a communist side that actually reunified. And of course, the German experience continues to inform some of the debate that takes place in Korea about reconciliation, potential reconciliation with North Korea. But now there is talk about other experiences. So there is talk about the Helsinki process, for example. There is talk about the experience of Northern Ireland, unless, at least until Brexit happened, the Northern Ireland experience was a success story in terms of two communities that reconciled with each other. There's also discussion about the experience of the European Union itself, which I think Teresa alluded to. It was a peace project when it was created. And I think that three key areas in which we can see the European experience inform what the Koreas could do with each other in terms of trying to move towards reconciliation. I'm not even talking about reunification because that's more of a long-term plan, but reconciliation is more of a short to mid-term plan, at least for the current South Korean government. First of all, we have to look at the European experience and the value of patience. Peace, reconciliation among different European countries or among different European communities was a process that took years, when not decades. So if you look at the German experience, if you look at Northern Ireland, we had decades of different initiatives being taken by different groups, civil society groups, politicians as well, of course, to try to bring about reconciliation, in the case of Germany, eventual reunification. And I think this is something that you can clearly see with the current Korean government. It wanted to create a sustainable process that would withstand changes in government in South Korea. Since every 5 years we have a new president, it hasn't been able to do so. For different reasons. So we can blame the South Korean government itself, we can blame the pandemic, we can blame President Trump, or we can blame North Korea, but the process is clearly not in place. But it is interesting that the current government still thinks that it can launch a process or relaunch a process of reconciliation building on the 2018 agreements, and then this process can be the starting point for the next administration that will be taking office starting from the spring of next year, from May of next year, after the election that will take place in March. So this is one of the European lessons, so to speak, that even when it seems that any peace reconciliation process is about to collapse, that there is no hope for the future, well, there are those who think that we should still try to go for engagement, and that this can serve as a template for future administrations and for civil society groups that obviously cut across different administrations to continue to pursue peace and reconciliation. So this could be the first lesson, so to speak, from the European experience. The second one would be the need to have different types of engagement. It is good to have engagement at the highest level between political leaders, between presidents, like we saw, for example, between President Moon and Kim Jong-un in the case of North Korea, when President Trump and Kim Jong-un. But that's not enough. Leaders in democratic countries, at least, at some point they will be gone, and there will be new leaders coming in that might have different agendas. So it is valuable to have this type of meetings at the highest level, but the engagement between different groups, civil society groups, is crucial. This could be NGOs, and of course, Antoine was talking about, for example, the experience of European NGOs working in North Korea. There are also businesses. For example, at some point we see the resumption of inter-Korean economic projects, which is a priority for the current administration. Then business links would be important to strengthen economic links. Cultural exchanges, of course, matter as well. And we have seen in the past, including in 2018, cultural exchanges between the two Koreas. For example, K-pop artists going to North Korea, North Korean artists coming to the Pyeongchang Olympics as well. So these cultural exchanges could supplement exchanges between business groups, civil society groups. So the point here is that reconciliation, if we look at the European experience, demands that different civil society groups are engaged in a process that can become sustainable and that engages different groups on the other side. And politicians are not necessarily able to do this because they have other priorities, so they engage at the political level. So this would be another potential lesson from the European experiences, not a single experience, but different experiences that we have been talking about. And the third lesson, I think would be, and I think Teresa actually touched upon on this, the importance of engaging not only the two Koreas, but potentially other countries as well. It is true that when it comes to reconciliation, of course, the two Koreas have to take the lead. They are the two countries that have to reconcile. They are the two countries that were separated in 1948, but the multilateralization of an engagement process with North Korea would be beneficial, because it would mean that it would help to bring North Korea out of the cold, right? That is the one of the two parties that obviously is more isolated today. And it would mean that little by little we could build more confidence with North Korea, but also North Korea could build more confidence with other parties, not only with the South Korean party in our reconciliation process, but with other parties. And yes, we do have NGOs. They had to leave the country because of COVID, but at some point we'll assume that they will go back. We do have embassies as well. They come from different countries, and in the case of Europe, they come from different European countries as well. We're not talking about one or two only. So there could be this process of multilateralization of engagement initiatives. And if we take the example of Pyeongchang Olympics, right, the Moon administration, one of the plans it had in mind is to show North Korea how it could be engaging in sport activities with different countries across the world. Of course, this is a one-off when we're talking about the Olympics, but later on, for example, we saw how the Korean government, South Korean government tried to have, for example, a joint handball team. This couldn't happen for political reasons, but this could be a way to engage North Korea with the rest of the world through sport activities in which they have to compete in a joint Korean team or by itself against other countries. When it comes to culture, we could talk about cultural fairs, for example, to which North Korea is invited. So North Korean cultural groups have been invited in some cases to tour, for example, in European countries, also to tour in Asian countries. This is something that could be done, for example, in bigger cultural festivals. And for example, South Korea wants to host one of the expos in 2030, 2032. So North Korea, for example, could be invited. So the point here is that if we look at the European experience, a reconciliation between two parties can involve third parties that also have an interest in the reconciliation of these two parties. In this case, it would be the two Koreas. And this could include, of course, European groups, but it could include groups from other countries. And for the very last minute that I have, just to point out that I do agree with the point that my colleagues have raised, that in the case of the European Union, we could argue that the critical component of the critical engagement policy has dominated in recent years. But I do think that within different European Union member states and also within the European Union, you can see a wave of opinion saying, well, maybe we should go back to engagement, maybe even using the COVID situation as a starting point to try to reach out to North Korea. And I think this potential move towards using engagement and not only the critical component of the policy would support the 3 points that I have just mentioned that would help in the inter-Korean reconciliation process. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much for giving me this time.
Wonderful, Ramon. And I only want to make one remark, because about 15 years ago, I was a member in a group that talked about the Helsinki process and whether there are any lessons for the Korean Peninsula. And I have to say, we came to the conclusion that this is probably the least transferable experience, because first of all, the nuclear issue was left out of the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process took place under a very different global system there were 2 blocks. And the third probably is the most important. We advertise the Helsinki process as ultimately what brought the Eastern Bloc down. And if we do that, it's more a deterrence to other countries who fear exactly that, regime change and other things. So it was very unique circumstances that made the Helsinki process a success. And we met many times, including people who were participating in the Helsinki process. But what struck me was that they said they just talked until they were too tired to talk anymore. I mean, they basically talked for years, and that alludes to what the virtue of patience. Now, finally, we will have a comment from our ambassador, the EU ambassador to South Korea, and I'm sure she will put us all right if our ideas are too crazy for real politics to even look into. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much to all of you, and to the Korean Global Forum for Peace for allowing me to be part of these discussions for the first time in many years, since I'm now back in the Korean Peninsula. All this, I mean, is for us very interesting to hear what the other side, or how the outside world perceive us, and if what we are doing, is right or not. All these critics are very useful for all of us, and it contributes a lot to the inside, to the policy making that we are doing, and to our daily work. Let me start by underlining a bit more what Antoine said about that the EU has always been there. We have been, I would say, working in the backseat in a way, in different ways, in different angles, but we have been there, present in more than people realize, and I think that's very important. And we haven't gone away. So it was not only our participation in KEDO. The KEDO Secretariat was the European Commission. It was a partner of mine sitting in the next door of my office, dealing with KEDO, and also our contribution also on KEDO. But it was also and not only our humanitarian assistance. Antoine has mentioned all the things we have been doing. When I say us, it's also the member states, of course, together, Team Europe together in DPRK, doing a lot of things for many years since 1995, especially in the very hard years of the famine and where we had to really put a lot of efforts in this. But also we had a political dialogue at that time, and I remember many times going to Pyongyang to discuss issues like we are discussing here, relations with the US, relations with China, and even human rights. We had 2 dialogues, even if it sounds strange, but we had dialogues on human rights with the PRK, like we had with other countries in the world. So this was that made us perhaps understand a bit more the situation on the ground, reach out and leave some communication links, which is important. The humanitarian aid is very important. This allowed us not only to help the vulnerable people, and we really have made an impact. I heard yesterday some comments that our assistance is very limited. It's limited, but it matters, and it makes a difference to many people which are in very poor conditions. And it also allowed us to reach out to local communities, local authorities, other ministries. I'm speaking about Ministry of Agriculture, of Science, other ministries that are not the security ones. And I think that allows us for better understanding. And the big thing in DPRK is that there is not an understanding of what is the situation now with the closure of what is happening there. What little information comes out is very useful. So to have our presence, our NGOs there, is very, very important. And I remember one of the last things I did was to negotiate the presence of those NGOs that they could stay in Pyongyang. And I'm very happy to see they are still there after all these years. So this is very important, to have some eyes there, to have people who have the patience, as Ramon said, to reach out and be in contact with people that are that need. So that is very important. Of course, our policy then turned out to more critical engagement. Some say, and you have said it, that the critical part perhaps is more profound and has been more profound in the last years. That is probably true. But I think the pressure through sanctions was important. It was an agreement by all international community. It's a UN Security Council resolution. We have in Europe perhaps added more autonomous sanctions regime and others. But it is very important that this should work, because still the core objective of the international community is the nuclearization, and this is very important. Full implementation of sanctions. Sometimes you see us doing the march in many countries, and I think that it's important for the sanctions to work. The fact that DPRK's demand for lifting the sanctions is there is because they are working, they're having some impact. You cannot tell me, they have had a serious impact in the proliferation flows, in trade, in finance. They have cut a lot of the finance linkage that DPRK had all over the world. And of course, they have contributed to the political isolation of the region. That is certainly true. Of course, no regime of sanctions is 100%, perfect, and there are loopholes and it can be improved. But the fact that it was done in unanimity, that the international community is behind it, it's very important to underline. What is also very important is close cooperation, very close cooperation between the main players. South Korea, US, China. China, it was mentioned by Teresa and Ramon, is very important. We need to reach out to. This is not part of competition, I say, or cooperation. This is part of necessity, I would say, for all of us and for the world. So we need to reach out and put China in the map, perhaps more than has been done now. But you see this already happening, very close cooperation between the new Biden administration and Korea and Japan. They are always speaking. They also reach to us, so there is a lot more contact, I must say, in this of exchange and bringing us into the process, which is important, because dialogue is key. It was said in the previous session before us, the need for engagement, the need for communication, and when there is no dialogue, we cannot reach out. So perhaps that is also for us. We need more dialogue now, and that. I agree. We need more engagement, more dialogue. Would be necessary, but we need to speak out in everything. Let us, we always see the European Union speaking out in human rights, because it's key and core to what we do, and we think that it is the case. We do it with all the countries, but we need to keep it on the table. It's important. We cannot choose and pick what we can. We want to which area we want to deal. I think we need to bring that all in the table. What is important is now that we have this dialogue to bring our diplomats and our humanitarian workers back. They have all left, but we need to bring them back. This is very important, to have these channels of communication, to have this possibility of understanding what is happening, and avoid misunderstandings, which create unnecessary tensions on the ground. And we have enough possibilities for tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So we don't need to add. Let me end by saying that yes, we are committed to be part of the solution, to be part of any support in any initiative, bilateral, international, that will bring dialogue, will bring peace and denuclearization to the peninsula. We are not a major player, but we are a player. We can be a facilitator. We can be a useful partner. I think you all have put cases of us being a useful partner and a meaningful contribution. When we put a lot of money in KEDO. We have put a lot of money on humanitarian aid, and we could put it in future possible agreements. And it's an added channel of communication, an additional one which we need channels of communication. And this, if this is possible, we are certainly regard as a more neutral partner. And the fact that we have people on the ground and they are engaging, there is a certain trust that is being built, and that is important. This, of course, now we have the Indo-Pacific strategy, which will come in 2 weeks' time out, and certainly, as Eric puts it, the link with security in Asia and in Europe is very, very important. But as Antoine said, there's more than security. There is climate change, there is health, there is human rights. There are many other areas where, are all pertinent to Korean Peninsula. This is not about naming every country and everything. This is an Indo-Pacific strategy that covers and needs to be open and allow for different partnerships depending on values and interests that we have at a certain point. So I think that to put or not to put a Korean Peninsula or DPRK there, and that is not the issue. The issue is the possibility to use this mechanism to re-engage. It's things that we have been doing, but it's really a political commitment to re-engage again with our partners in the region and do it more. And that's why, of course, Eric mentioned we have been engaging a lot in the last year on security, but also on climate with partners like Korea, South Korea, and the issue about what we will do if one day, North Korea opens up. Climate will be a key issue of engagement. If you just see the forest and the hills on the other side of the border, which are completely empty, and you see what has happened in the south, you understand a lot of what can be done. But Europe can help. Europe can serve certainly as a lesson learned. We can share. We have been doing a lot of projects already on humanitarian and forestry, helping with the floods. You mentioned, Antoine, disaster preparedness. We have been helping in many local communities already on floods. So there is already some work that can be shared and can help others when they want to come in bigger ways. Teresa mentioned yes, multilateralism. I agree. That is very necessary. At one point, it will have to be. Even if it starts with a bilateral initiative, it has to be. And we bring lessons from other negotiations, difficult ones, like the one with the GCPOA, which certainly it's very important. And the fact that it still stands, it was because it was a multilateral framework, certainly. But also, yes, confident in the measures, reconciliation, peace. There is a lot we can do, and we are sharing already. And we have 27 member states, and they can bring so many experience into the table. I remember those economic exchanges and workshops that Antoine referred to in the past, which I contribute to organize, where we brought Eastern European high-level officials, which could come and explain what they did when they also came out from the communist regime into more open liberal market economy. So there is a lot we can offer, but certainly now is to support what others are doing in order to bring dialogue and communication to start, because that is what is missing. So any venue is certainly necessary, the Indo-Pacific strategy will provide us even more framework, perhaps then to make, if conditions are different and changes, to make to think about what will be our role in more detailed way.
Thank you very much. I think you basically agreed with the speakers that, these ideas are very important, that engagement, more channels of communication, the more the better, so to speak, engage on all levels. And the EU is already doing a lot in that respect. I wanted to pick up on one thing you said, which is that the EU can be a facilitator and it's considered to be neutral. I think this is one of the issues we will probably facing with the Indo-Pacific strategy, how to balance, remaining this neutral actor and engaging more, including on hard security issues, because there might come a time where we have to make some hard choices and also pay a certain price for making these choices. And to take sides means you can no longer be a neutral facilitator. So we have to tread careful about that. And I will give you back the word immediately. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I would ask you, Ambassador, if you want to comment on this a little bit further, but also ask the others whether they have any responses to the inputs the others made. I don't want to do your work for you, so to speak. So, Ambassador, if you want to add something, go ahead.
Yes. No. I mean, it's true. We need to be also coherent with our principles, and that will also bring a certain risk. I mean, the decision we made on the human rights sanctioned regime, not long ago, with not only DPRK but other countries, China and others, which was coherent to our principles, and we have that tool, and of course that also brings risk and reactions. But it's important, there is. We can, as I said, if we have some. Not so much a neutral, but historically, we none of our countries have a difficult link or history with both Korea and South Korea. So that gives us a possibility, to be able to build a trust that we don't have any historical baggage. So that is important, and that helps to build trust. I think, like in everything in human relations and in diplomacy, you need to build trust, and that takes time, as Ramon says. It takes patience. 8 years, of me when I dealt with DPRK in the past. After 8 years, the people you speak to them, you can reach out to them. So this is important, and human trust then allows for things to at least to better understanding, even if, that will help also the Americans and the South Koreans. Well, for me, what is important is also the inter-Korean link. Inter-Korean, I will sometimes say that is it's a link that has to work. If North and South don't speak to each other, then the American and North Koreans will not understand each other. That is very important. And so if we can help, that's why, if we can help that message through, if you see the periods of ups and downs of the story of Korean Peninsula, the ups are always where this link functions, and the downs are the ones where this link doesn't function. So I think it's very important that we all support it, and that that consultation that I mentioned before is so important. And when I see them now speaking so much, and also to us and others, keep us. They will need everyone at the end. It will be a multilateral process, verification process, or there is so much need that we all have to come in. So therefore, it's important that we speak and that we coordinate and we consult each other. And that trust that we have as partners, like-minded partners, that will come more with the Indo-Pacific strategy, will certainly help also the process in the peninsula.
Thank you for that. One small remark. As a German, it's always mind-boggling to me to talk to people in Asia about confidence-building measures, because the answer you always get is we don't have enough trust to do confidence-building measures. And for me, because in German there is only one word for confidence and for trust. So for me, this is just, I can't wrap my head around that. It's really a question also of the words you use. I understand there is a difference between confidence and trust in English, but because the German thinking is so different due to the language limitations, you just don't get it, what they are talking about. Ramon, you wanted to say something, and then Antoine. Use the hand raise function if you want to say something.
Yes, thank you. I only wanted to add a couple of points. The first one, based on what many of the fellow speakers have been talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the role of the Korean Peninsula, and it's true that the strategy is not out, but I think we do know that cooperation with partners, and especially with like-minded partners, is going to be an important component of the strategy, and among them, South Korea is going to be, if not in the top tier, very near to the top tier in terms of cooperation, and I think it's quite clear that security cooperation between the EU and South Korea has increased dramatically in recent months and years. I mean, in my case, I've been following this topic for 15 years, and 15 years ago, there was no security cooperation to speak of. Even 5 years ago, it was limited. Now there is much more cooperation. But this actually opens the door, because this is welcomed by the South Koreans, actually. This opens the door for the EU to play maybe even a more important role in the Korean Peninsula, because now you actually see South Korea being invited to discuss other security issues with the European Union and European countries such as Germany and France, for example, very active in South Korea on maritime security, for example. But on the other hand, this opens the door for the European Union to have a more powerful voice, so to speak, in the Korean Peninsula. So I think that's a welcome development. And based on, as I said, on my recent visit to South Korea, was the depth of discussion about security cooperation between Europe and South Korea has changed, I would say, fairly dramatically since before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the EU is much more welcome in the peninsula. So that's welcome development for us. And the second point, which is the importance of confidence that a few of us, the patience that a few of us touch upon, and Gudrun, you said, right, there was the difference between trust and confidence, right? I think the issue in the Korean Peninsula and in South Korea has been that sometimes when a new administration has come in, trying to differentiate itself from the previous one, they have come up with their own North Korea policy, and sometimes they have clearly moved away from engagement, right? Even though engagement was part of their policy, it was really secondary to pressure, sanctions, or the US-ROK alliance, for example. So I think that goes back to the point that FIOS have been making, and one of the messages that came out of this session is the importance of civil society and engagement between different groups that will keep pressing for engagement and can create the necessary trust between groups, maybe not at the government level, but between different groups. And in the case with North Korea, when you engage with North Koreans, even attract to dialogue, somehow they are connected to government if they don't come from government directly. So I think these other types of engagement can build the confidence that will mean that new South Korean governments would have something to build on when it comes to a more long-term and patient process. And I'll leave it there so my colleagues can also participate. Thank you.
Yes, I suggest that Antoine and Eric, you use that as famous last words and wrap up the session with your remarks. We're running out of time, so please be brief. Antoine, you're next.
Sure. I will be very brief. First, on the question of what role can play the Europeans. Of course, we cannot easily be mediator, but facilitator is of course something very important. Facilitator and intermediary. Very often, the North Korean, of course, criticizes for being partial and not neutral because of the autonomous sanctions. But I think there is, of course, the two level. There is a political level, and the North Korean authorities will keep saying it. They have to, and that's part of the game, I would say. And there is the other level, I would say the working level, in which we can be useful and we can play a role. They know it. And even though they will not formulate it this way, there is a window of opportunity. So always to keep, of course, these two levels, the very political level, the element langage we have to all keep, etc., and the working level. The second one, to our South Korean friend, is of course our role as intermediary. There are many things that we can do that the South Korean NGOs, that the South Korean government, that the Korean think tank cannot do directly with the North Korean, and something that of course the Americans or even the Japanese cannot do as well. And we can be useful for that. We can be useful as intermediary to initiate some project in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also to initiate some dialogue. So these two aspects, facilitator and intermediary, of course, at the EU and EU member state level is very important, and our South Korean friends should really take full use of it.
Thank you, Antoine. Eric, you have the final word, which should be something like 1 minute long, according to my watch.
Yeah, thank you very much. I firstly want to use the opportunity to thank my co-panelists. Thank you, Gudrun, for moderating, for hosting this session. Thank you, Her Excellency Maria Castillo-Fernandez, for participating and for giving us, so to say, as Gudrun said, a reality check from the part of the decision makers. One final thought, I think, which basically links all of our presentation. We all stressed the role of multilateralism when it comes to Korea. It often says for a European role that it will come after some sort of solution, and that Europe can play a role after some sort of solution when it comes to basically overseeing the process of disarmament and things like this. I think what I take from this session today also would be that we should think more thoroughly about how we can multilateralize engagement initiatives as such to create stake beyond the US and the Koreas in the peace process, and also to broaden the scope of engagement beyond state actors. And so to say, create a stake for a broader set of actors in this regard. Like I said, I want to thank all of you for participating. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And last but not least, of course, thank you to Tongil-gu for organizing this year's Korea Global Peace Forum. And I hope to see you all next year.
Thank you from my side as well, to the panelists, to our commentator, and to the audience who had no chance to ask questions or had no questions. Thank you all, and I don't know what the program will look like, but somebody, I think, will explain. So this panel, I declare over now. Thank you.